to grow almost 6,000 acres of miscanthus. Somewhere in the region of 300 farmers have invested in it, and there was a belief, rightly or wrongly, there was a belief out there that they would have an outlet for this crop when it would be grown and when it would be ready to harvest. And now it seems that that outlet through the refit programme and indeed through any other scheme is not available. And there are many, many people that have invested heavily in it. They have secured or at least believe that they were securing their future in relation to it. And now what I would see is that there's nearly 100 jobs associated with it from the grower's point of view, and we are now informed that the refit scheme will only come into being in 2015, and maybe I'm delighted that the Minister is here himself to answer the question, but I think the issue that I would have to bring to the floor of the House is that there is over 300 farmers in nearly every community, but particularly in my own community and that of West Limerick as well, that have bought into this, that have planted a crop, and that there was always an expectation that the outlet for the crop would be through the Bordamona and through the Eden Dairy plant, and that has now failed to be. And there is a belief out there within those people that have invested that the department is not coming up trumps in relation to it. Without waxing lyrically on it, I mean, I think I have put the issue because people are concerned about their future, they're concerned about their investment, and maybe that the Minister might clarify the position for us.
Thanks, Deputy Minister Pat Rabbitte. The Minister has 4 minutes.
Thanks, Cathaoirleach. I'm glad that Deputy Moynihan has raised this issue, because it is an issue that I'm concerned about and that I know a little about, and that I met the company directly to try and tease out the issue. The background, Cathaoirleach, is that in order to meet our 2020 binding targets to increase renewable energy to 40% in the electricity sector, 10% in the transport sector and 12% in the heating sector, the government is committed to meet these targets under the 2009 Renewable Energy Directive. In order to meet our current energy demands, we're importing about 90% of our fuel requirements at a cost of approximately €6 billion per annum. Developing robust indigenous renewable sources of energy will help Ireland to meet our 2020 targets and reduce our dependence on these fossil fuel imports. February 2012, I opened a refit scheme for biomass technologies in order to promote the use of renewable energy from biomass. Refit 3, which is the one Deputy Moynihan is referring to, was designed to incentivise the addition of 310 megawatts of renewable electricity capacity to the Irish electricity grid. The technologies being supported include anaerobic digestion and combined heat and power, which will also contribute to our renewable heat targets. It also contains incentives for co-firing of biomass, including energy crops such as miscanthus and willow, in existing peat-powered generation plants, and use of biomass for generation of electricity only. The scheme operates by guaranteeing a minimum price for renewable electricity generated and sent to the grid over a 15-year period, and the cost of refit is borne by electricity consumers through the public service obligation, the PSO levy. Refit payments are made only to electricity suppliers for the renewable electricity exported to the grid. It was never intended to set out a tariff price for biomass itself, and prices paid to suppliers of biomass are a private contractual matter between the supplier and the electricity generator. The refit schemes are funded, which is paid for by all the electricity consumers. Refit 3 was designed in part to build upon the bioenergy scheme operated by the Department of Agriculture, which provides establishment grants to farmers to grow energy crops such as miscanthus and willow for use in renewable energy production. It is, however, important to note that the bioenergy scheme was opened in 2007, long before a refit scheme for biomass was mooted. Equally, refit 3 does not preclude the use of miscanthus by electricity generators other than those co-firing with peat. Miscanthus and other energy crops can be used as a fuel in both the heating and electricity sectors, whilst in terms of returns, Miscanthus has certain advantages over other energy crops. I understand that it's not suitable for all applications, and its high chlorine content can cause corrosion in some of the boilers. It is also bulky and expensive to transport, and therefore the economics work better when the plantations are close to where it is required. As a result, in conclusion, Cathaoirleach, the market for miscanthus is limited. I understand that most of the miscanthus is used for co-firing with peat at one of the power plants in the Midlands. I also understand that a small proportion is processed into heat logs and used in the heat sector. However, I believe that as new biomass plants supported by Refit 3 come online, this will create further demand for energy from biomass and miscanthus may have a role to play in contributing to meeting our renewable energy targets.
Thanks, Minister. Deputy Moynihan, you have 2 minutes for a supplementary.
Yeah, I thank you, Minister, for the reply. And I suppose the difficulty is that the reply seems to be, that we are at a logjam with those people that have invested in the industry and are now faced with a decision that they thought they had an outlet for it, and they're having a difficulty. I hadn't been informed that you had met the company, so you've met the company. You just in the last line, I suppose, what we're really looking for is to see what can be done to assess these people and to ensure that there is some outlet for them going forward. You mentioned as Refit 3 comes online, that it would create further demand for energy for biomass and miscanthus. When is that likely to happen, and what is the likelihood of that coming on stream in the short term? And I suppose, at the very start of it, is there any evidence within your department or within the Department of Agriculture, as you mentioned there in your address or your response, was there any detail or was there any commitment given by Bord na Móna or any others on when these farmers were investing in it? And maybe you might clarify those 2 points.
Thanks, Deputy Minister. You have 2 minutes.
Yeah, that last point, Cathaoirleach, is a critical point about, what was the understanding at the time? The company asserts that, I shouldn't say or go as far as saying that the company asserts that they were seduced into a contract at the time with Bord na Móna, and that now, they're in difficulty. Bord na Móna insists that that's not the way it happened. And in fact, I got a text since I came into the House here, communication from JHM concerned. Contact is going on right up to today between the company and my office about what, if anything, we can do to pull it out of the fire, if no pun intended. The difficulty is it's a private contract between the growers and GHM, the company acting as middleman, organises the farmers and transports the miscanthus to the plant in the Midlands. And now that contract is not rewarding the company for the costs of the enterprise involved, and that's the difficulty. Even if Bord na Móna went into refit in 6 months' time, the difference would not be adequate to maintain any kind of viable margin for JHM. Now, I've talked to the Minister for Agriculture as well about this, because 300 farmers have been given an expectation, as Deputy Moynihan says. That is a serious matter, apart entirely from the company that acts as the go-between being at risk. And, I'm talking to my colleague, the Minister for Agriculture, about it. It's a very difficult one, Chairman, when it comes down to a private commercial contract entered into between two parties. And the role of the state in that, is minimal, if at all. And even if, on the point that Deputy Moynihan raises, even if Bord na Móna went into refit 3 as soon as may be, the difference would be very little. And that's the problem that is there. As I say, the discussions are still going on. I'd like to see some solution to this. I mean, there are issues that Deputy Moynihan will know about the merits of miscanthus as compared to willow, and what miscanthus does to the plant, and the chlorine problem that arises, and all that kind of thing. But that's neither here nor there. There was or there wasn't a contract, and you know, it seems difficult to see where either the Department of Agriculture or my department can intrude to force Bord na Móna to do something if they think it's not in line with the contract or in line with their own commercial interests. And they dispute, there is a dispute as to what happened when the original contract came into being.
We now move on to the Health Service Executive Governance Bill 2012, and it's Deputy Bernard Durkin, and the Deputy is 20 minutes.
Thank you, Cahir. Look, I'm delighted to have an opportunity to speak at this particular piece of legislation, which you and I well know is a source of irritation to many of us in this House over a long number of years. I happen to come of the vintage that experienced the end of the old county health system and the beginning of the health board system, which was an interesting thing. And the late Erskine Childers is alleged to have said, in relation to the health board system when it was set up first, that could we not go back, when asked, could we not go back to the original system? And he was reputed to have said, how can you unscramble an egg? Well, I'm afraid, Cahir, look, that the egg has been scrambled a good few times since then. And the whole question of how the health service should be run has come into focus on numerous occasions in the last number of years. But I have to say this, having experienced and been involved in the health board system, I believe that it was a system where there was accountability and there was responsibility and there was action. And that was in response to the probings of elected public representatives of the services, where the major players in the health services were involved. The GPs were involved, the nursing profession was involved, psychiatric services were involved, the consultants were involved, and the chemists were involved. The major players were on board in the old health boards. And the reason they were on board, they were brought on board for a particular reason, because it was necessary, it was felt at the time that it was necessary, in 1970, it was felt necessary to ensure that the major players, the major contributors, would be in the same building at the same time, with the same responsibility, answering the same questions, accountable to the same people, and committed to the same vision. And that was the case. But unfortunately, as time passed, it became awkward in terms of administration. It became difficult, and questions were raised. And in fact, the now leader of the opposition was the person in charge at the time when it was decided that the health board should be abolished and a new system introduced. Now, I have to say, and Cahir, look, I strongly opposed that at the time, both within my party and anywhere that anybody wanted to listen to me, and I'm sure that not too many more people want to listen to me still, but I was still opposed to it, for a very, very good reason, I believed. One of the things that was advanced at the time as to why we should have a different system was the comparison made with the Greater Manchester area, Dáil, which had a similar population to this country. And management experts around this country, and several from outside the country, made their contribution where they opined that it should be possible to have a similar administration structure to those that prevailed in Manchester. They were wrong, Mr. Chairman. They were totally and absolutely wrong. Why were they wrong? Because it was chalk and cheese. We were talking about different geographical situations entirely. We had one situation where you had a compact urbanised population, which was easy to administer, where it was possible to walk from one end of it to the other end, to actually walk from one end to the other end in a couple of hours. To a situation in this country, where if somebody attempted to walk from the south end of Kerry to the north end of Donegal in a couple of hours, he would very soon find out after a short while that there was a difference. And then if he wanted to move from there over to Carlingford, he'd find another difference. And back down to Wexford then and Watford at the other side of it, and around it again back to Kerry again, he'd soon find out there was a major difference. So I have to say that my view at the time was that, the equation was wrong, that there was no analogy at all. We were talking about chalk and cheese, totally different situation, and that attempt to superimpose a similar structure in this jurisdiction would not work. Now, I have to say, look, I know that you and I have discussed this many times in the past as well. And I don't claim to be the only one to be right on this, because I know an awful lot of other people have the same view. But I was right, and it didn't work. I remember asking the first appointed chief executive of the HSE as to whether or not he felt that a single executive authority was the appropriate authority to administer the health service in this country. And he famously said, look, I don't know. I don't know. But he knows now. And everybody else knows as well. And that's a sad fact of reality. So the point I want to emphasise in relation to that is simply this. We attempted to impose a structure that was seen to be, in management circles, the ideal response to a situation, and it wasn't, because they didn't know what the situation was. So what happened then was, we saw a situation which we anticipated, where we could, in the opposition benches at that time, put down questions to the Minister for Health, to be told the Minister has no responsibility to the House. And I remember getting refusal after refusal from the Can-Corla's office, no reflection on the Can-Corla at all. This is the advice that was prevailing at the time, that the Minister had no responsibility, to such an extent that he eventually inquired as to whether or not any Minister had any responsibility. But when I hear complaints coming from that side of the House today about a lack of accountability and lack of responsibility, I know about that, because I was there, and you were there too, and we learned an awful harsh lesson during that period. I want to say this. I want to pay tribute to the present Minister, and he knows me well enough to know now that I don't pay tribute too readily. But I do want to pay tribute in this sense, that there's a dramatic difference in the way questions to the Department of Health are responded to as compared to the way they were responded to in the previous administration. That's no reflection on the previous administration, because I presume they didn't know what was happening. They didn't know most of what was happening anyway. That was an admission by ministers themselves. So I want to say this. While it is not the ideal situation that we've had, there was a huge response in terms of the way questions are answered. And I want to recognise that and acknowledge it. However, it is not the ideal situation. Nor can it ever be. Nor will it ever be. And all I can say is this. Somebody can say, who do you think you are? Why do you think you should be right? And I know I'm not always right. But the fact of the matter is this. In this particular instance, it is beyond any shadow of doubt that those who held that view, along with me, at that time, were right. But we didn't wait until now to find out. My first point, look. My second point is in relation to accountability and the composite bodies that were involved in the health boards at the time. As I said, we had the consultants, we had the nursing representatives, we had the GPs, we had the chemists, and we had the administrators. And we had the individuals who were directly accountable. 3 people, 3 programme managers, our best 4, were accountable to all of the area. Take the Eastern Health Board, which is the biggest health board in the country, where it was possible to gain access at the highest level instantly. But of course, you see, those who were opposed to this concept said, well, that's all wrong. It's too politician-oriented. We couldn't have that. In actual fact, what they were saying was there was too much accountability. And it was alleged you couldn't do anything. The politician wouldn't allow it. Well, I have to say, look, there are ways and means of dealing with that. I believe in responsible public representation as well as everybody else. And I think it's important when people are in either opposition or in government that they act responsibly. And one of the things that we learned to do during that period was to try to act responsibly. And that meant that you spent the money that you could afford. You spent what you had and nothing more. And you stayed within budget. But the budget was beginning to creep up and was getting out of hand. And for various reasons, we see the same things repeated in this House today, look. I have watched for the opposition benches promote excessive expenditure on a daily basis. Expenditure that we know this country can't afford. Expenditure that doesn't exist. Money that we have to borrow. Money we have to borrow at high interest rates. Money we have to beg for from our colleagues in Europe on a regular basis. And we have people sitting on the benches across there who want to spend it at every hand's turn. At every hand's turn, it is being spent lavishly and pretending to the people that it is possible to do things that are totally and absolutely impossible. I want to say too, one of the things that I learned during that particular period was the need to respond to the patient's requirements, to the public requirements. So it is all very fine to say, A, we will provide a certain degree and quality of service. We will provide after-hour service. And incidentally, I want to pay particular compliment to the tremendous cohort of people who provided those services down through the years, with very little recognition, at consultant level, at GP level, at chemist, nursing level, at every possible level throughout the whole structure of the health services. There were people who gave above and beyond what was required in order to contribute to the sum total of what was the response by the health services at that particular time. They did extremely well. Unheralded and unsung, they stand to this day, and unrecognised to a large extent, but they did it. And that included also the GPs during that period, who were represented on the health boards. And those GPs who worked extremely long hours, started their clinics in the morning, in the afternoon, and in the evening, 6 days a week and 7 days a week, and did so without any need or call by anybody to call upon them to do it. They did it in response to the need. And that's the vocational calling. That's the vocational calling that applies in education, in politics, in the health services, and the whole distribution of public service. That vocational calling is disappearing at an alarming rate at Cathaoirleach. And I hope that at some time in the not too distant future, that vocational calling will be rediscovered, because it is hugely essential and central to the delivery of health services. So in acknowledging the quality and commitment of the GPs and consultants of that period under the 1970 Act, I want to say they did well. They provided what was needed in response to the needs of the people. So time moves on, and we have to move on to a different scene. So now we ask ourselves the next question, and a view that I've held for many long day. I believe the whole structure of the HSE should be abolished. I believe that's the requirement. I believe the Minister for Health, whoever the Minister for Health should be directly responsible to the House and should answer questions in the House, as the present Minister, in fairness to him, does to a large extent. In many cases, they're referred to the HSE for direct reply, and I can understand that. But the carry-on that we experienced for a long number of years, as we sat over on those benches over there, you and I, Cathaoirleach, and others as well, and had to put up with the nonsense we put up with over that period, I think it is appalling. And to find out that we have critics coming from that side of the House as in regard to the present system is equally alarming. But I believe, in any event, that the system should be changed completely, and it should reconstruct. The new system should reconstruct the structures of the old health boards. Less health boards, maybe 2 or 3 or whatever the case may be, because there are differing requirements and differing demands. There are different requirements in the urbanised areas, in the Greater Dublin area, and there are different demands and requirements in the vast rural areas of this country. And it isn't sufficient to say, well, you know, we'll concentrate where the population is. Every person in this country, every person in this jurisdiction is entitled to their fair degree of service under the Constitution. Otherwise, to do otherwise is wrong. So I believe that the structure that exists there should be completely abolished and should be replaced. I believe also that the structure there should be a centralised system where the budget is determined on the basis of submissions received from the various constituent boards, and that they be given responsibility for running the health services within their area in whatever way possible, and that the public and the private sector don't seem to trip and shouldn't trip over each other and get involved in turf wars or get involved in financial wars, but should be totally focused on delivering to the public. I believe also that part and parcel of that should be public representation. Local authority level, there should be representation at local authority level. There should be Oireachtas representation. There should be Dáil and Senate representation for however long the Senate remains, and that's going to be a matter for the people anyway. I believe there should be representation from the GPs, the consultants, and the nursing and pharmaceutical profession. I believe all the professions involved in the delivery of the health services should be involved there. And they should be charged with the responsibility of delivering the services, be accountable, and also be responsible in the way they do their business. I think that would be a huge challenge. It's a challenge for Irish people, it's a challenge for politics in this country, and it is also a challenge for European people. As we know, when we look around amongst our European colleagues, there is a tendency nowadays to resile from reality and to pretend, that if we ignore things, they will go away. Nothing goes away. We have to accept responsibility. And when in accepting responsibility, if that means that we have to tell the people, look, we don't have enough to do the job you expect us to do, or we are doing the job but not doing it in the way you expect us to do it, then I think we should acknowledge that. I think there are huge areas of economies that can be made, particularly in relation of procurement. And during my time on the Health Board, I remember we involved ourselves in an exercise which resulted in massive savings. Incidentally, there were opponents to that in terms of generic prescribing. There were opponents to it, I have to tell you, a Cahill, some of whom were in this House, some of whom were very loquacious in the way they opposed the proposal, on the basis that, no, they didn't tell us what the real basis was, but the reality of it was there must have been some basis as to why they should have been so impressed with the necessity to go along with the brand names. But we proved our point, and it was workable. We also set about proving a point. We set about determining where prescriptions were the most economically prescribed in the various European countries, including Spain. And we decided to use that as a template for achieving the best we could for our own citizens here in this country. And I think it was very effective. Then along came a certain minister, and in deference to him, I won't say anything, I won't mention him by name in the House. But it was decided anyway that the health services were costing too much. And there was too much democracy there, and there was too much intervention from the various constituent bodies. And as a result of that, it was decided to abolish the health boards and replace them with the HSE. What a disaster. Because not alone was there no money saved, which was the original intention, not alone was the Secretary General of the Department moved sideways in the course of the machinations that took place at that particular time, but particularly and specifically, the whole cost of the service escalated at an unprecedented level and to an unprecedented extent. It was an appalling disaster. And no matter who tells me otherwise, I will hold that view until the day I die. It was an appalling disaster to abolish the health boards and replace them with the kind of a structure that we have replaced with. No disrespect at all whatsoever to the people who were given the responsibility for that structure. No disrespect whatsoever to the very many thousands of health professionals who were condemned to work within the structure, but a huge condemnation of the people who determined that that was the kind of appropriate structure we should have to run the health services in this country. So I would have to say here, look, that I have strong views on the subject, as you and I well know, because we've exchanged these views many times in the past. And I have no doubt we will exchange these views many times into the future. And I know also that the Minister, Dr. James Riley, is cognizant of the fact that some of us in this House, have serious concerns about this particular issue. I hope that what is now being proposed will be revised and reviewed, and that a structure similar to the lines that what I have suggested, I don't claim to be the only authority in this business, but I spent 20 years on the board to learn a little bit about it for my various sins, and I must have been very sinful at Cahill, because I was there for that length of time. And I have to say this, I learned a great deal, and I met many of the great people who forged the structures for the delivery of health services in this country, who were trailblazers in medicine, who did a tremendous job in addressing the people's concerns and the issues raised by the people over that particular period. I believe it was an excellent structure. It needed some refinement. There's no doubt about that. Like when the refinement came and the amendments came, they came from the government of the day, who decided, first of all, to increase the number of health boards to 8 and then to 11, which was an extraordinary intervention of 1 minute. I wish it was more than that, Cahill, but I will conclude in the 1 minute. I have to say this, that it would take much longer to go through in great detail. But as I said previously on many occasions in relation to the HSE, and I want to emphasise, this is not a personal reflection on the membership of the staff of the HSE over the past number of years at all. The countless people who have done a great job. It is a reflection on the structure. Totally inappropriate to deal with the services required in this country, totally inappropriate in terms of accountability, totally inappropriate in terms of recognising the changing times and the need to respond to the needs of the people in a meaningful and democratic way. Thank you.
Thanks, Deputy. Deputy Richard Barrett, and the Deputy's 20 minutes.
Minister, yeah, as I think Deputy Durkan was suggesting, and as I suspect most people in the country would agree, that there's very few institutions that are in as bad need of a fundamental reorganisation of how they operate as the HSE. The HSE has no credibility whatsoever, really, in the eyes of the wider public or in the users of the health service. It is important to qualify that statement, however, by saying there is an almost universal phenomena where everybody who engages pretty much with the health service says the nurses, the doctors, the staff, the frontline staff are wonderful, but the way in which the thing is organised or getting into the system is a nightmare. So anything that is said here, and I'm sure other speakers have underlined this point, is not a criticism of the really heroic frontline staff in the health service, whether it's the ambulance drivers, the nurses, the various medical practitioners, the doctors and so on, all do a wonderful job, but under difficult circumstances and within a structure that is just utterly dysfunctional. And that doesn't work. Excuse me. I don't know how to turn these things off. Anyway, and my phone is dysfunctional as well. But the so we need. It is a positive move to want to reorganise the structure, and I would also say that it is a positive move if, as this bill suggests, that this is a transition bill towards a better structure, which will be more responsive to the needs of those who use the health service, of patients and so on, and will better deliver services and will end the really unacceptable scenario where whenever you asked questions about the dysfunctional nature of the HSE of politicians, you were basically told that was an operational matter, that's a matter for the HSE, and where politicians really took no responsibility for what went on or what went wrong within the health service. So the aspirations are good. The rhetoric is good. But I think it is worth saying that the rhetoric in 2004, when the HSE was set up, was good too. The quote, I think, is pretty telling, frankly, from Mary Harney in 2004 that is provided in the digest. The rhetoric is electrifying. You'd really think you were on the brink of a wonderful revolution in the way health services were delivered. Just to quote a bit of it. This is a historic piece of legislation. How many times have we heard that? It provides for the most comprehensive reorganisation of our health services since 1970, which is long overdue and vital. It is a once-in-a-generation event. It is our generation's chance to put patients first in the design of and the management of health services. It is our chance to put in place a modern, effective management to make best use of these tremendous resources we are applying to health and to get clear value and clear results for that money. And it goes on. I mean, to be honest, there's not much difference between that rhetoric that we heard in 2004 and the rhetoric we hear now. And the big question is whether the reality of the new transition and reorganisation of the health services from what they are, utterly dysfunctional, to what they need to be, modern, efficient, providing the services that people desperately need, is actually going to transpire in reality. I'm sure Mary Harney sounded very convincing when she made that speech, but the reality didn't match up. And what we need to know is that the reality is going to match up this time round. And I'll put my cards on the table, Minister. You see, I think you are trying to square a circle that cannot be squared, because I think it comes down to resources. Bottom line, I think it comes down to resources. I'm not saying there aren't structural issues of management and mismanagement and better organisation, which your government puts a lot of emphasis, and Fine Gael historically have put a lot of emphasis on that, and the government's big emphasis on that. We need better management. But it doesn't stack up to me, that argument. I'm not saying we don't need better management, but I think it is glossing over the fundamental problem as to where does bureaucracy come from. I mean, does bureaucracy just arise because we didn't think up the right structures? And, you know, I'm sure the structures that now make up the HSE at the time, which followed the rhetoric of Mary Harney's speech, probably sounded reasonably convincing. I'm sure there was lots of arguments about how health boards weren't terribly functional, that they were, you know, somewhat corrupted by political influence and cronyism, and so on and so forth, and it probably all sounded very good. And directorates based on particular areas of service provision, if you like, or of care, sound very good. But is this the problem? I ask myself. I mean, directorates. I don't know if directorates is a reference to the French Revolution and Robespierre, but sounds good to me. It sounds very revolutionary, and the reorganisation of the health services along the lines of particular areas of care. But is structures the problem? Or is it the main problem? And I would put it to you, Minister, it isn't really the main problem. It may be a problem, and they probably could be redesigned, but I don't think it's the key problem. Somebody whose name you probably can't even mention in polite company without getting laughs on certain sides of this House, but I'll just say a revolutionary from the turn of the century explained how bureaucracy develops. And he said, bureaucracy develops because of shortages. He said, actually, bureaucracy and corruption develops from shortages. And he gave the example of a bread shop. And he said, if the shop is full and packed full of bread and has enough for everybody who's going to come in and out of that shop, you don't get a queue. So it's fine. People come in and out and they get the bread as they need it. He said, the problem is, if you've got a shortage in the bread shop, then a queue forms. Then people start jostling with each other as to who's going to be up the front of the queue. And also, once you have a queue, you start to need somebody who'll keep the queue in order. And the person whose job it is to keep the queue in order often seems like quite an arbitrary and coercive power, keeping in line these people are queuing up for the bread they desperately need. And he pointed out, furthermore, that the person whose job it is to order the queue is very vulnerable to corruption, even if they didn't start out as a corrupt person, because they have power over the access of other people to scarce resources. And to my mind, that analogy, that allegory, if you like, of how bureaucracy and corruption develops is really at the heart of the problems with the health service. And I don't see how you can resolve the problem of great layers of bureaucracy that are dysfunctional, mismanaging the health service, when the problem is we don't have the resources. We're cutting the elements in the health service that actually work. We're cutting the numbers of nurses. To bring us back to the initial point. Everybody says the nurses are wonderful. The frontline staff are wonderful. What have we done to the numbers of frontline staff? Slash them. The one thing that works, we're cutting them. And we're demoralising them with pay cuts and income cuts. So even if they were wonderful up until now, they certainly aren't feeling very wonderful anymore, and you just wonder how long their goodwill can last under the hammer of those cuts. And yet they are the one part of the health service that doesn't work. And now we have ambulance drivers and so on withdrawing their goodwill for the same reasons. Because they say we're working our backs off trying to provide these services. Everybody acknowledges that we do it well. And what do we get for it? We get cut. We get attacked. We're asked to work longer and harder for less. How can this work? I put it to you, Minister, it can't. And I think maybe the lack of detail as to these directorates and what follows on in what you describe as the transition that this legislation is, as to what we are transitioning to, maybe tells its own story in that regard. Maybe a dawning awareness of that fact. This is, as I understand, stated government policy, a transition towards the model of universal health insurance. Sorry, my notes are just falling down. Universal health insurance. We need to know what this model is going to look like. But as I've said to you before, the Dutch model, which you initially talked quite a lot about, I'm not sure if that's still the model that we are following. The evidence is piling up in the Netherlands that what actually the Dutch model produces is ever higher insurance costs, health insurance costs. And more of the resources and money that goes into the health service being taken up with the bureaucracy of the private health insurance system. And of course, the most dramatic and developed example of this is in the United States, which is the ultimate sort of example of where private health insurance companies and the idea of universal health insurance as delivered by private health companies is the main model. In contrast to, for example, the National Health Service model in Britain, set up at the end of the Second World War, where everybody just gets health care free and it is paid for out of general taxation. So this seems to be a transition towards that failed, in my opinion, model in the United States, failing model insofar as it's been developed in the Netherlands, and increasingly the public becoming angered and outraged over the increased costs. The facts about the American model are shocking. They spend more on health than anybody else, but 40% of it is wasted in administration. And the reason it is wasted in administration is because they're billing. It's for money. They're billing. So you have a massive administration for billing people. And that's what it's about. So it's not going into the frontline services. That's not primarily what it is there for. It is there to make money, so you have a huge bureaucracy whose job is to capture the money. Instead of financing it through the revenue, through a system of taxation that already exists and which is progressive and can capture the funding necessary for public services without creating a new privatised bureaucracy whose main job is to make money and who will push up insurance premiums as it needs be. And I ask the question in that context, Minister, because there's really so little detail in this bill. Is the main concrete thing in this bill the separation of service provision from procurement? Is that really what's going on here? That it is setting it up for the move towards privatisation, where services will be purchased by the private health insurance companies, and provision comes from, if you like, the public system. God, my notes here are a disaster. And I suspect that is the case. And I would urge you not to go in that direction, because I think it is a failed model, and that the alternative is more in the direction of the British health service model. And insofar as it is a positive step that you are seeking to take more personal responsibility for what goes on in the health service, I do see that as positive, but it needs to be balanced. It needs checks and balances at a local level, and this is where I agree with Deputy Penrose when he talks about the old health boards, if you like, a localised form of governance of health services at a local level, reformed, not as they were, not made up of cronies and so on, but made up of patients' representatives, health professionals, representatives, real stakeholders, representatives of the workforce and so on, and maybe some elected representatives representing the wider public, being there to see at the other end how policy translates. But the worry about this, as I see it, is we're preparing for the outsourcing of much of it to private health insurance companies, and then we have these directorates standing above it, possibly competing for resources among themselves, but still quite a top-down structure, and that worries me. And I just want to finish. I don't know how long I've left.
You have 3.5 minutes.
3.5 minutes. I just want to finish with, on that latter point, Minister, just about the importance, if you like, of some sort of localised oversight and management of health services. And I want to bring to you what may be, and on the face of it, the evidence suggests is, an absolutely shocking example of the mismanagement of health service funds, HSE funds, in the area of home helps. Now, I'm reluctant to go into too much detail because the charges that are made are very, very serious against home help companies in the Fingal and Wicklow areas, where there is substantial evidence and allegations have been put forward by employees in both of these places of absolutely rampant misappropriation of HSE funds, very large amounts of funds that were being put into the HSE into these home help services in Wicklow and in Fingal, and where the allegations suggest a misappropriation of hundreds and hundreds of thousands, getting into the millions of funds. One of these companies was getting $250,000 a month from the HSE, and where the allegations are of company credit cards being used to finance people going on holidays, buy cars, absolutely no oversight of the expenditure of these funds, any sort of proper regulation on how the place is being run, dealing with very vulnerable people, absolutely being flouted, and people who blew the whistle being pushed out, sacked, and so on. And I won't go into much more detail of that. Some small snippets of this appeared in the papers before Christmas, I think. But some of the people directly involved have come to me and said they've met an absolute brick wall in trying to get proper investigations into these matters as to what they say is really rampant corruption and misappropriation of, scarce resources supposed to be directed towards a very vulnerable sector of our society from the public purse via the HSE, and the HSE were nowhere to be seen in providing proper oversight over this.
Deputy, you have 1 minute.
It is not clear at all to me, Minister, from what you have got in this bill, or from the lack of detail of where this is going, but that the new structures you're proposing are going to deal with this problem. That you would have that level of local oversight to see what is happening with the money, with monies that are being allocated centrally. What's being done with them? Are, if you like, the local units delivering the health service to vulnerable citizens, are they being managed properly? Are the resources actually going to the patients, the staff, and so on, who deliver the services? Which is, I think, the sort of role that a health board, a reformed health board system operating at a local level, made up of stakeholders, would be far better at doing. And obviously, as I said, most of all, I am concerned that this is really just facilitating the move towards the Dutch or American model, which is based on making money out of scarce resources and out of healthcare, which I don't think is the way to deliver the desperately reformed health service that everybody wants.
Thanks, Deputy. Deputy Dan Neville, and the Deputy has 5 minutes.
I welcome the opportunity to contribute to the Health Service Executive Governance Bill. And I'm not surprised that this has been introduced, because when I was involved in the debate in setting up the HSE Executive, I expressed my extreme concerns in relation to the development of a monolithic organisation like that. I appreciate that some of the objectives were to ensure that there was coordination between the old health boards, and there was consistency in relation to the services that were being delivered. But I think it could have been achieved while maintaining and reforming the local mental health boards themselves. Yes, there were some difficulties with the old mental health boards, but I think we threw out the baby with the bathwater in relation to how that was handled at the time. We have now a situation where we have very little input by the service users, the interested parties, the public representatives, the professionals. Because I was on the Midwestern Health Board for 7 years. In fact, I was in the Association of Health Boards in Ireland, and a lot of good work was done in relation to bringing to the attention of ministers and to the houses here in relation to difficulties experienced by people, and bringing at a local level to the managers of the health boards each month at a meeting where you had the public representatives on the board, you had representatives from the various consultants, dentists, nurses, and so on and so forth, who would question in public, in the presence of the public and in presence of the media, concerns in relation to the delivery of the services, and were made, and the health boards were made aware of the concerns and the needs that were out there, and the changes and development in the requirements of the general public in relation to the delivery of the health services. And further than that, the Minister was responsible for what was happening throughout the country in relation to the delivery of those services. Now, the setting up of the Health Service Executive changed all that input, all that level of opportunity for the deliverers of the health service to have an input from those who were at the coalface experiencing out in the public or with their patients in relation to difficulties experienced. Also, the removal of the responsibility for the delivery of the health services from the Minister, other than the policy, created a situation when there was a lack of accountability to these houses for a lot of the delivery, which was expressed by some others in relation to the reply to parliamentary questions in relation to the delivery of the health services, which is not the responsibility of the Minister. And in certain circumstances, the health service executive is quite tardy in relation to the response to requests from the Minister to reply to the question being answered, and it can be extremely frustrating to those of us who want to respond to the concerns of our constituents, to the issues which we raised. Now, of course, we welcome in the context of that, we welcome that the bill will abolish the structure of the HSE and provide for a directorate to be the governing body for the HSE in place of the board headed by a director general.
1 minute.
And to provide accountability arrangements for the HSE, which I think this is very important. I just want to raise the issue of how important it is that a decision has been made to appoint a director of the mental health services, and that the recruitment is is ongoing, and that he will have full control of the delivery of the mental health services. And I would just also like to say that I would like to welcome the appointment of Mr. Jerry Raleigh as Director of the National Office of Suicide Prevention, which has had a lot of difficulties over the past 12 months, not least that the fact that money is allocated by the Minister to the work of suicide prevention, suicide postvention and research, that some of that money last year was not spent. And it's important that the 35 million allocated in the budget to the delivery of the health services again this year, a total of 17 in the past 2 years, is spent in the most appropriate way for the delivery of a vision for change, because there has been debate about the spending of some of the resources last year. I understand the complications that arose in relation to the delay in the formation of the service plan on the 35 million and the recruitment of the 411 consultants and professionals in relation to the community-based mental health services. And I think that an early, maybe the Minister in his response would also inform us of the plan for the delivery and improvement of the services based on this year's allocation of 35 million, because we would very much like to know what is happening with the 35 million this year at this point, at this stage of the year.
Thanks, Deputy. Deputy Tom Barry, and the Deputy is 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. I welcome the opportunity to speak on this bill. The Government is committed to the eventual dissolution of the HSE. However, this is a complex process which will take time, and this bill therefore is a transitional measure along that path. The bill is all about accountability, and the aim of this bill is to make the HSE more directly accountable to our Minister for Health. The essence of this bill will see the abolition of the board structure of HSE and a directorate created as a new governing body, headed by a Director General. The Directorate does not have fixed numbers of members, but the bill provides for a maximum of 7 and a minimum of 3. And this should allow flexibility for the Directorate to deal with circumstances as they arise. It is important to stress here that the HSE will continue to have the operational responsibility for running the health service. The Director General will account on behalf of the Directorate through the Minister to this, and like any large corporate structure, you need to have good governance practices and structures in order to implement the changes that are necessary, especially in times of great change. This bill will aim to make sure that the government policies and objectives relating to the HSE functions are implemented, and this is no mean task. The Minister will specify his priorities for the HSE, and the HSE must have regard for these in preparing their service plan. And like any good plan, it must have performance targets, metrics to establish performance. The HSE must pay particular regard to these targets as they are set out for them. These operational changes will ensure that large organisations will have greater flexibility and will be able to react more quickly as change is required. I would also like to stress that while this bill is about making sure that the HSE reacts faster and in the direction that the Minister wants, my experience with the HSE in the South has been very positive. Everybody likes to criticise the HSE, but there are certainly a lot of good points there.
It would be wrong of anyone to suggest that all areas of the HSE are not performing. Only last week, the reconfiguration plan involving Cork University Hospital and Mallow General Hospital reached a point of implementation, and the HSE and its staff played a pivotal role, liaising with all the consultants and